Hey everyone, welcome to the first unit, which we're really going to call Unit 0 of AP World History. This is what we call the Foundations period, and it's going to roughly cover, in a very small nutshell, 8000 BCE to 1200 CE. Now, a lot of stuff that I'm going to cover today is going to be stuff that you will not see on an AP exam. There will be no direct questions about anything I do cover. But the reason why I am doing this is because I'm trying to establish this idea of where history essentially starts for the human race and how it progresses to the point when we get into our actual curriculum. Another reason for this is because it's important when we think about history that we also need to talk about context. And context is something that you will have to do and show a lot during the course of the year. Any writing assignment, particularly the DBQ or the LEQ, you are going to need to be able to establish contextualization of the events up to the moment in time that you will be writing about in your prompt. So essentially context is the circumstances, well, the definition of it is circumstances that form the setting for an event, statement, or idea in terms of which it can be fully understood and assessed. Sometimes I like to use the metaphor, or the example, I should better say, of the Star Wars movies. And if anyone's ever seen a Star Wars movie, you're welcome, not because of something I've done, but because you get to enjoy a great piece of culture. And every Star Wars movie always starts off with the context, and that's that scrolling screen of here's the situation, what's going on, and then it drops you into the movie at that moment in time, right as after establishing that context. So anytime we think about history, think about what are the events and things that have led up to the moment in history in which we are going to be talking about and writing about throughout the course of the year. So that's why we're doing the Unit 0. So you'll be tested on nothing but, context and an essay about, hey, here's the things that kind of shaped the moment of history to the point we start is important to know and understand, okay? So starting off very simply, we're going to talk about during the Paleolithic time, this time period, humans are primarily hunters and gatherers, and they're nomadic, so they move around a lot. We'll talk about, most of them start in Africa and then spread to all corners of the globe. They go and establish settlements in every continent with the exception of Antarctica. Nomadic hunters, because they're following their food, many of them gatherers, gathering whatever edible foods that were on the landscape wherever they're living and traveling to. And then they began to use tools. They could have used tools as early as several 100,000 years ago. And they progressively get better at making tools from things like stone, wood, and bone during this time period. They master fire. The use of fire, being able to start fires and such, really changes a lot of things for humans. They can move into environments that they've never been able to live in because of the climate. They could cook their meat, which acts almost like a second stomach to help break down the proteins and become a more absorbable nutrient, which then, according to some scholars and such, helps kind of develop the brains, and because of the extra protein and our brain power expands, so forth. We invent things like language and other things to communicate with each other. So we're a unique species on the earth, and the Paleolithic period is the longest period in human history, but even then, it's prior to 8000 BCE. So they leave Africa, they settle different places in the world. This little map here kind of gives you an understanding of what archaeological evidence shows about the spread of humans. And keep in mind that this is kind of the current thinking, but there's always new data and new findings that challenge our notion. So is this exact? We don't know. There are some fossils that have been found that do challenge our assumption of how this happened. But the majority of the scholarly community believe that the human race and humans began on the continent of Africa, South Africa, East Africa, and then from there spread into all different parts of the world. Now, about 8000 BCE, and there's no exact date in which this happens, And it doesn't happen the same way or same place in all of the world, but an event that becomes one of the most important events in human history is known as the Neolithic Revolution. And when we're talking about revolution, we're talking about something that's going to change the way human beings are, the way that they live. In around 8,000 BCE, some human groups began to develop the idea of agriculture, being able to identify plants they wanted to eat, be able to find ways to take the seeds from those plants, plant them in the ground, and then regrow them season after season after season. And so developing agriculture is a pretty huge moment in human history. And it doesn't happen everywhere. It happens in 6 places in the world independently. Mesoamerica, the Andean region in South America, the Nile River Valley in Egypt, the Indus River Valley between what is now modern-day India and Pakistan, Mesopotamia, which is where modern-day Iraq and Iran is, and the Honhoi, I've never pronounced these things right, river region. Most people in the West refer to this as the Yellow River, so the Yellow River region. And those are the independent areas in which agriculture started. And then from there, it spreads to different places, but doesn't happen immediately, and it takes a very long time to do that. Now, when they discover agriculture, they identify those plants that they like to grow, that provide nutrients for them, that provide things they like to eat, that taste good, whatever it is, and they begin to domesticate animals in some areas as well. And I'll talk more about the domestication of animals in the next slide. But this changes the way human beings live as they adopt this idea of sedentarism, where they are going to stay in one place and they live a sedentary lifestyle, not moving around anymore like they used to in previous ones, because now they can basically plant their food and then plant themselves into one area and invest into manipulating the environment in a way that it best benefits them. So building things like canals or irrigation systems, terrace farming, other things that help them be able to grow more food. And they identify plants and animals that are not desirable to them, and they try to eliminate them. And so, it changes the environment. And so over time, that is something that continues. There are significant demographic changes. Populations begin to increase because they can provide more food, and it doesn't necessarily mean that hunting and gathering couldn't, but it also, hunting and gathering, there's a limitation of what is in the environment for you to eat, so it kind of ends up keeping populations somewhat smaller. And some people will assume that people were healthier after they started to grow their own food, and that's not necessarily true. But it also does mean that they can provide more and always grow more if they need more. So populations begin to increase over time because of the Neolithic Revolution. There's significant social changes. Things like patriarchy, where men become kind of dominant in society and such. This was something that we didn't see evidence of in the previous periods of history. It more or less came along when agriculture came along for reasons that are too complex to explain in this video today. But you see the establishment of social groups, of social classes, where you have people who become wealthy. The more materials they have, the higher in society do they have within the social bounds there. They also begin to create complex economic social systems through trade, through exchange of goods. It could have been started as simply as, hey, you have a surplus of this crop, I have a surplus of this crop, let's exchange our surpluses so that we both get more stuff that we want. And that's how economies were started, and over time it spread to more people, and seeking out more different kinds of food, more items of desire and luxury, and that's the establishment of economic systems. And then this is kind of where the first wave of civilization started to come from, is from the establishment of being able to create these complex societies and economies, and civilizations grow from there. It should be worth noting as well that not just human civilizations were created from just the intention of agriculture as far as growing plants, it also is going to be about their ability to use the landscape to provide for themselves in different ways. Some human groups began to practice something called pastoralism, and this is where they identify certain breeds of animals and livestock, and then they breed them and eat them, use the other materials for other things and so forth. So especially in the continents of Africa, Europe, and Asia, or as we call Afro-Eurasia, they begin to domesticate all different types of animals: sheep, cattle, horses, pigs, chickens, things like that, and similar to what we do today. And so they identified those types of animals that they could easily control, they could easily breed, and they grow or raise and breed more of those. The interaction between those who farmed and those who did pastoralism differs, and there are two main ways in which they interacted with each other. They traded a lot because the pastoralists had the means to pack materials, things like, let's say, grains, and put into bags and then put it on a horse and then carry it over long distances to trade with other farm groups a different crop that they would want that was desirable to them as well. So the interaction of them was often through a mutually beneficial one in trade. And this way that the human diet becomes more diverse. There's some meat, there's some plants. That's kind of intends to be beneficial or is viewed as beneficial to the human race over the long time. The other way that they can interact is raid, where some types or some pastoralist people, because of environmental changes, they can sometimes overgraze their fields, and they have large-scale animals die, and so then that kind of leads to desperation, and so they'll attack these farm groups who have food and steal from them, and so this kind of ends up to being the relationship. Either it's going to be trade or raid with agricultural societies versus pastoral societies, and something you'll kind of see in the next period of history, where you'll have one of the largest, most important pastoralist societies, the Mongols. They're definitely all about trade and raid both. So new technologies were created over time to try to improve the ability to get more food, more production, to be able to trade more. So things like pottery, the wheel, irrigation, plows, woven textiles, wheeled vehicles, and metallurgy, all become new technologies that are developed over time as these new civilizations grow. They want to be able to make more food. They want to be able to, make it easier for ways to transport that food or those products across the civilization and the different groups that are part of it. So that's something that's important. Technology is always an improving aspect of history. And as new technologies get introduced, it changes the way humans live. Some of these, the wheel itself, where would the world be without the invention of a wheel? And so, from there, new things are created, new ways of transporting, of new military technology, all sorts of things you can add into there. So the other thing that happens in the revolution I mentioned is that we start to see more specialization. I already talked about the reliability of more abundant food, which kind of increases the population. Well, if you have more people in a society, you don't need the same amount of people or same percentage of people in your society to work about trying to find food and work for the human or for the group. So people had to find other ways to contribute to society, contribute to the group. And started to specialize in different jobs and different artisan crafts, so forth. Some people became warriors, some people became artisans, some people ended up becoming kind of rulers and the elites that help guide society in the direction that is trying to be beneficial to the human group in general. I already mentioned that patriarchy kind of forms from this new social organization. Something that you'll see continue throughout history is this idea of patriarchal order, where men tend to have a higher benefit in society than women do. And we'll talk more specifics about that and what that looks like throughout the course of the year. So the first civilizations, kind of born 5,000 years ago, kind of looking at the map, it's the same map as where you see agriculture develop. And then these weren't the only ones. And just also important to note is that despite the fact that civilizations have come, majority of the humans on the earth still are practicing nomadic hunting gathering lifestyles in much of the world. And agriculture slowly gets introduced in other parts of the world as well. Even today, there are some groups who still are hunter and gatherers and live a Paleolithic lifestyle. But some of the early civilizations, Sumerian, Babylonian civilizations in Mesopotamia, the Egyptian civilization, one of the most famous because of the archaeological evidence, archaeological art pieces that are left behind by that civilization that make their way into the British Museum and kind of the minds of the Western world. Developed in Egypt. Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, they are the Indus River Valley civilizations, these cities that were built there. The Shane and Chou dynasties along the Yellow River Valley civilization right here. Some of the early ones of these dynasties, basically families that ruled for a good long period of time. The Olmecs in Mesopotamia, which were one of the earliest civilizations in Mesoamerica, a lot of mystery behind the Olmecs. They did leave archaeological evidence behind, including these giant stone heads that were carved from stone that are really impressive, but not a lot is known about the Olmecs compared to civilizations that come after them in Mesoamerica. The Norte Chico and the Chavan civilizations in South America, particularly in the Andes region, these are some of the first civilizations that developed. And we kind of identify them as civilizations because they do have some commonalities with them. And so, one thing that you see is that these new states, as they develop, they're finding new methods to both justify the rule of the rulers as well as to help organize society even more so. So that all the people have kind of a general guidance or something. I don't know if that's the right term, but understanding of how you function in that society and that human group. So things like building monumental architecture, things like the pyramids, the ziggurats in Mesopotamia, the pyramids in Egypt. There's other examples from all these civilizations of these giant monumental architecture or use of art to justify the rule of the rulers. For example, if you don't know it already, the pyramids were built as tombs to the early pharaohs and the old kingdom of the Egyptian dynastic rule. And so, how do you convince a population if you don't have a certain amount of power authority over them to build these gigantic monuments with technology that's very rudimentary compared to today, and do so when they're trying to live their lives and so forth, just to build significant giant tombs for them. So things like that are good examples of kind of showing legitimacy of the rule, and why monumental architecture does kind of show the power that these early rulers had, right? So they also had writing systems, and writing systems took different forms in different areas. Cuneiform was something that was found in Mesopotamia, which essentially they would just roll out clay when it's wet, and then they would have these little stencils that they would press into the clay and form these symbols that would identify essentially pictograms of what they, like something they mean. A lot of them were used, the writing systems are used to track like surplus of the their crops and things like that, and keep track of that. But one of the earliest literary works, novels, epic poems, what do you want to call it, was written in Mesopotamia. This was the Epic of Gilgamesh. If you are curious of what the name of that was, but the Epic of Gilgamesh was originally written in cuneiform and such. So, it takes another step to what writing is used for. Hieroglyphics were one form of writing in Egypt. They also had other forms. This one was commonly used in religious practices. This is why you will find these more commonly in the tombs of the Egyptian pharaohs. Another unique one, writing form. It's very different from everything else. You can't write stories from it, at least not to my understanding. But it's called the quipu, and these were something that were used in the Andes region by the Chavan and the Norte Chico. But basically, it's like a long string with a bunch of strings tied to it, and then they would tie knots into it, and the knots would represent certain numbers. And this is something way that they could keep track of their crops, the surplus, and so forth. But that was, it's considered an early writing form of the Andean region, and it's unique in that sense, right? There's a creation of religious beliefs, and we'll talk more about religions here a little bit later, but some of the earliest religious beliefs start in this early time period, these early civilizations, such as Judaism, Zoroastrianism, the Vedic religions, which kind of end up becoming kind of an early part that Hinduism is based off of. So there's a lot of things that are going on there. And there's a lot of interregional trade. The Mesopotamians trade with the Egyptians, their surpluses of stuff. So there's interaction between cross regions between human beings in this early era. And that's something that will continue and expand throughout history, is the interaction of different human groups across the globe, region to region, continent to continent, and so on and so forth. So as time goes on, a lot of new religions are going to form and codify. And when I mean codify, they kind of write down what is the belief system, what are the laws and the rules of how you function within the belief system, things of that nature. So some of the earliest religions, Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, and Judaism, are three of the earliest religions. Over time, new religions are introduced, and these are things that we would have talked about in the old curriculum of AP World History, but we just don't do it as often. And we'll talk more detail about some of these when we get into our curriculum for Unit 1 and 2. But things like Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, Christianity, which comes in the midst of the Roman Empire, towards the end of the Roman Empire, Islam, which will come in a different period in history. All of these are starting to show up. And some religious beliefs do persist throughout. And even today, you'll find some of these. It's much rarer today than it was in this times. But animism, which kind of believed that essentially all living creatures and non-living creatures had the spirits to them. It's hard to nail down what the true belief or the exact beliefs of animism is, because it's different for lots of different people around the world and such. Animism could look like a form of animism could look different in Western Africa compared to South America or something. So those are some things. It's hard to narrow down, but we kind of categorize it as the kind of this idea of a spiritual belief or spiritual presence in living and non-living things. Shamanism, something that comes up a little bit when we get to the Mongols. But the idea is this shamans having this kind of holy power, and this can identify signs in nature and life that could point to direction forward. Ancestral veneration, the worship of ancestors, that's something that also persists and is found in some of the other major religions too. But those are the kind of other religious beliefs that persist despite the fact that these new religions do start to come along during this time period. So as time goes on, and we're going to get into what period we call the classical period, we see the formation of new empires. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about in this video, because I want to link to other videos, YouTube videos that do go into more detail on the Canvas page about each one of these. And these are going to be just for your own curiosity. If you love history like I love history, you want to check these out, because all of these empires certainly add new things that affect daily life today even. So the Persian Empire, which was kind of found in the Middle East, one of the most powerful empires in the world for a very long time. They expanded trade. They spread a lot of ideas, monumental architecture, everything. I mean, I can't really get into too much details because it would just take a lot of time for every one of these. The Qin, the Han dynasties, which it persisted in China. They both had major contributions to kind of the establishment of the Chinese civilization. The Han Empire was really equivalent to the Roman Empire at the time, as far as the most powerful and widespread empires in the world. The Miran and the Gupta empires of South Asia, where modern India is, each one of them had good long rule of period of time in South India, or South Asia, I should say. The Phoenicians, which was a really interesting kind of sea trading and maritime people, where they would, Phoenicia was, in this area right here. But then they kind of colonized lots of different areas along the Mediterranean Sea. Major seafaring traders colonized the different parts of the Mediterranean and were pretty powerful owners of the Mediterranean Sea until like the Greeks and the Romans will challenge them, and the Romans will eventually destroy the remains of the Phoenician civilization. But the Phoenicia, one of the things that their big contribution to human history and that affects our daily lives is the Phoenician alphabet, the idea of a set number of symbols and then putting those symbols together in different forms that creates words, ideas, concepts, whatever you want to say for that. And the Greeks were the ones who kind of took the idea of the Phoenician alphabet and created their own alphabet. And so that's something, the major contribution that they made to societies, to the world we live in today. The Greek city-states Greek civilization was never this united civilization, and if it was usually for a very short period of time, and then they would have civil wars and breaks up and so forth. But the Greek civilization, very important, adding things like democracy, philosophy, the idea of the scientific theory, and those are things that are major contributions of the Greeks themselves. And again, check out the videos on the Greeks, one of my favorite civilizations. I'm sad I no longer get to talk about for AP World. The Hellenistic, it's not Greek, it's part Greek, I guess. But the Hellenistic Empire is the empire of Alexander the Great, kind of short-lived, but extremely important because of the spread of ideas of Greek ideas across parts of the world that then combined with ideas in what am I trying to say? They combine ideas with other ones of their ideas and so forth, and kind of help advance human civilization more so. But anyway, the Roman Empire, I could talk about the Roman Empire for days, of how much history and contributions the Romans made into really formulating Europe and advancing human civilization in a lot of ways. Major engineers. I mean, the Romans were conquerors, but they were major engineers. A lot of their roads that they built this giant road system. A lot of them still around today, not used in like the same sense we use roads, but parts of Italy will be you can hike on a Roman road still, and so things like that happened. Mesoamerica, you have a civilization. This is something we're going to continue to talk about in the next period because they continue on after this. Is the beginnings of the Mayan civilization in Tenochtitlan. I never pronounced that right, I'm sure, but the Mayan city-states, never united civilization, but certainly a major civilization in Central America that's worth noting and such. The Chavan and the Moche civilizations, which were in the Andes region, contributing to the growth of that civilization, and we'll talk about the successors of these civilizations and the Incans in more detail when we get to that part of the curriculum. But just know that the Incans didn't come out of nowhere. They built their civilization on the advancements of these civilizations, the Chavan, the Moche, and to a lesser extent the Norte Chico. The Chaco Canyon and Cahokia, these are just more or less the Chaco Canyon, is found in kind of modern day southwestern United States. Sometimes they're known as the Pueblos. And they had lots of monumental architecture. Mesa Verde, which if you look right here, is Mesa Verde is right here. This is a civilization that is around for a good long time. And their ruins still persist and still there today. The Cahokia was this major city-state in what is now Illinois, southern Illinois. Was once a monument, or maybe what do you call it, earthworks civilization. We'll talk about them a little bit more too, but they were around beforehand, and they'll be around in the next period as well. So new empires also led to new techniques in ruling, to kind of hold their authority over people more so. These rulers and these empires, they created more elaborate written laws, more elaborate bureaucracies where people had specific jobs that kind of help lead society in some sort of way. Issuing of currency, the building of fortifications, roads, and other public works. The Romans built these beautiful aqueducts that many of them still stand today, to help bring fresh water to the people of Rome and all the other cities that they built in their empire. They build and maintain these strong militaries. They organize new cities in different ways, so that the flow of traffic and people, and just to slow down disease spreading, things like that. The use of labor systems, different types of labor systems, from slavery to free laborers, peasants, things like that, happened during these time periods. And then you have the continuation of patriarchy that's persists from earlier in history we talked about, beginning to now. All empires collapse eventually, and they do for some different reasons. The Romans had a lot of different internal problems, external and internal problems, and they were invaded by Germanic tribes such as the Visigoths, which eventually sacked Rome in 410 CE, and then the Vandals came. And they just had problems with that, weren't able to keep their empire together. It split into two parts earlier. One part, the Western Empire, did not survive. The Eastern Empire does survive. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But yeah, each one of these, they have their rise and they have their fall, and that's what happens with empires. They eventually fall. Interregional trade or interregional exchange, it would expand to different parts of the world. There are really major the beginnings of major trade networks that happened during this period that will continue into the next period that we talk about more commonly. But these trade networks would trade people, they trade ideas such as religious beliefs, they would trade disease, not on purpose, obviously, but disease was spread because of these exchange networks as well. And before there was the Black Death, which we'll talk about in the curriculum, there were other plagues that hit different parts of the world because of the movement of people and goods that carried these diseases, right? So new technologies made the trade more possible. Things like the yoke, horseback saddles, stirrups and such, allow people to use those animals to pack more stuff on, to carry themselves as well. And so this helped facilitate trade even more so. Other technologies such as lateen sails, Laten, lateen, the triangle sails that could catch the winds. Prior to the lateen sails, a lot of the boats, and especially in the Mediterranean, they had sails. They were called triremes, but the boats were called the triremes. They had sails, but they also had manpower, where they had rowers that would use oars to kind of move the boat along and so forth. But the lateen sails helped catch the wind better and make it so that trade could happen more easily as a result. So you didn't have as many people working on a boat to be able to trade a lot more goods, right? There are four major trade networks you ought to know about. These are things we'll continue in the next period and such. The Silk Roads, which are right here, in connecting kind of East Asia all the way to the Middle East, and then making its way into other trade networks such as the Mediterranean Sea Trade Network and so forth. Mediterranean Sea routes, which were a big part of why, major civilizations like the Romans, the Greeks, the Phoenicians and the Egyptians were all part of at some point. The Mediterranean Sea being a relatively calm sea allowed for the movement of boats to go across with a certain amount of safety and so forth. Much better than outside when we started getting to the Atlantic and the Pacific, which some people were able to navigate the Pacific. The Polynesian people are able to migrate across the Pacific Islands because the Pacific is relatively calm sea compared to the Atlantic Ocean. The Indian Ocean Trade Network also kind of a somewhat calm sea, but this is something that existed prior to the periods of history that we'll get into, and then of course it will expand more in the next period of history. But we'll talk more about the Indian Ocean Trade Network in more detail when we get to it, but do understand that this was a trade network that had already existed in the previous periods of history, but it expands more so. So talk about change and continuity, what changes and then what continues. And the same thing with the Trans-Saharan Desert. Trans-Saharan Trade, this giant desert where it's a lot of it's inhabitable. Humans are able to cross over the desert using different methods, particularly the use of camels. This is something that existed prior to the period of history that we started curriculum in, but it expands more so after 1200 itself. So something we'll talk about more when we get to that, okay? So that is basically the end of our Unit 0, something that will just give you an idea, understanding of what does our history somewhat look like prior to our curriculum. This is just something to help you guys understand where we got to this point. So I hope that it helps you better understand what we will be learning about more so over the course of the year. So make sure that you answer any questions that are related to this topic in the Canvas page. Make sure that you are doing the assignments that are associated with this, if there are going to be any. And then I will see you next lecture.